Hello and welcome. This panel discussion is part of a series of discussions made possible by a partnership between the Bowen Institute for Political Participation at Ball State University and the Mike Down Center for Indiana Politics at IPFW. I want to thank CATV for recording these for us, and I want to let you know that this first topic we're going to be talking about is covering government. What's it like to be a news professional covering government and politics? Our panelists are Bob Caylor from the News-Sentinel and Corinne Rose from Indiana's News Center. I want to thank both of you for being here today. Sure. And I think we're going to have a good time talking about this, but I want you to start just by giving a minute or two description of your experiences or your credentials as a reporter. We'll start with Bob.
Well, I've worked at the News-Sentinel for 20 years. This last month was my 20th anniversary there. And that's, when I first started, I concentrated much more strongly on kind of human interest pieces. But as the newspaper staff has contracted, those have fallen by the wayside, and we're really looking more at kind of the core coverage points, and there's nothing more central to what newspapers should cover than government. So I'm doing a lot more of that than I used to now. And throughout that time, I've done a fair amount of political coverage as well.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Corinne?
Bob, you said your anniversary. Congratulations. My 14th anniversary is coming up next month.
Congratulations.
So, well, thank you. Been at Indiana's News Center since it was 21 Alive, years and years ago. Started out mainly covering crime, which is an aspect of local government.
Sometimes a little more closely aligned with
I am
others.
From Chicago, so I understand that very well. And as Bob said, the industry is changing, and as we have contracted our staff as well, our reporters are what's known as general assignment reporters. We have beats that we tend to cover. If somebody's more of a specialist in one thing than another, we try to give stories to those types of reporters, but we all cover the gamut of whatever stories are, so we get a wide variety of the topics that we cover. So I've certainly covered my share of local government, and ranging anywhere from, public safety meetings at police headquarters to county council meetings to major campaigns, and had the opportunity to have a one-on-one with Hillary Clinton in this past presidential primary. So, I mean, it really runs the gamut of what politics is.
Yeah, and really the length of time you've spent here, after all that time doing yeoman's work, you finally got a presidential campaign that actually came to town, which had to be a little exciting for you.
Thrilling. Yeah, thrilling that Indiana finally mattered in a primary.
That's right.
One day.
I was
Every
6 the last time that happened. So.
Well, I want to start with what sounds like a simple question, but I know it's not. Give us a definition of newsworthy. People will think they have something that's newsworthy. They'll issue news releases about it. They'll call press conferences, and then you all get there and you say, maybe not really worth a story. What's a good definition of newsworthy, Corinne?
I think it's something that either is going to be what we call a water cooler topic, where people are going to be at the office the next day standing around talking about it, or it's something that's going to impact a lot of people's lives. I think those are two pretty broad definitions of what we would consider to be newsworthy. If it's something that grabs your attention, it's something that people are going to think about, they're going to talk with their neighbors, they're going to go, Mom, did you hear that story? That's something that we would want to look into a little bit more deeply. Or if it's something that maybe isn't quite as sexy, but it's a zoning board hearing that may affect a wide neighborhood of some sort, that we would need to go to a Board of Zoning Appeals meeting to cover that. So I think that those would be two pretty big criteria for what we would consider to be newsworthy. Sure,
and some of those meetings that people think are boring, like a plan commission or a BZA, that's sometimes where you find some of the best news, though, right?
Well, that's where a lot of the meat is, and I think a lot of people tend to dismiss that because, let's face it, a sewer task force meeting is not terribly sexy. It's not. But when you're talking about the federal government has mandated that we need to spend $200, $300 million, and we're not going to give you any money to do it, that money is going to come from your tax money. And so you need to know where your taxes are going to be going and why the EPA has mandated that we separate these sewers in town over the next 20 years or so. I mean, that's something that it's not terribly sexy, but people need to know.
Sure. Well, if dollars equals sexy, though, sewers are about to become very, very sexy.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. Bob, what's your definition of newsworthy?
I think of it as I would add the element of novelty or something out of the ordinary to Corinne's definition. I think of it as the interplay of novelty, interest, and impact, the breadth of impact. So that's why there are so many different things that rate as newsworthy. Something that's unusual but nobody cares about it, well, we're not going to do a story about it. Something that's something that affects a lot of people but is absolutely ordinary, the sun rising, temperatures being normal for the season, we don't do a story about it. So that's really how the three things that I think about when I weigh the value of a story.
Well, you get, of course, you have to have sources for this information. Sometimes those sources are political campaigns or office holders. Sometimes there are other things. When a lot of people in the public hear someone use the expression source, they get sort of the deep throat kind of, they're looking for somebody in a parking garage who's going to give you great insight. Where do you get most of your information for news stories? We'll start with Bob.
Well, an awful lot of it that comes from public documents and open meetings. Those are really the foundations of where you get information about how government works. Now, you get tips from sources that will lead you in a particular direction, but my experience here is there's an awful lot of off-the-record kind of secret source tipping that goes on, but there isn't much tolerance locally in any news outlets for blind attribution. There aren't a lot of unnamed sources that carry stories by themselves in Fort Wayne, and I think that's a good thing, and it keeps a lot of mischief out of government here, because when you look at the national level and you see how many times what we call trial balloons, proposals for policy are floated in national media without any attribution to a source, I can't think of when that happens here. I mean, it may have happened once in a great while, but it's very uncommon, and I think that compels people in government here to be a little more serious and a little more accountable when they can't just drop things unattributed in print.
Corinne, sources, where do you find them? You already mentioned you go to those BZA meetings, those Plan Commission Sewer Task Force. Where else do you find good sources?
I loved what Bob said about open meetings and public documents, because those are so crucial to be able to do our jobs. I mean, if you have somebody who's meeting that's got a quorum but it's a closed door, I mean, fortunately there aren't tons of issues like that here in Fort Wayne, but we've certainly had to file some requests under open door laws and that sort of thing. I would add to what Bob says that news gathering is so much about relationships with people. It's a personal thing. I mean, when you're covering news, you don't live in a bubble. We all live in the same community. You're going to run into people in the grocery store. You're maybe going to play a round of golf with somebody who works in the city-county building. I don't, but some of my colleagues do. And I think also your reputation and the work that you do, and if somebody needs to trust you, and if you don't burn a source, and you protect their identity if they need to be anonymous about something, then that person will trust that you again and again. And I know that Bob certainly would adhere to this rule. You never run with a story with just one source. I mean, that has to be independently confirmed by multiple sources before we would run something, because whenever somebody calls or emails or whatever they do, you always need to question what their motivation is. And you need to make sure that you understand kind of where they're coming from, so that we don't get policy trial balloons that are floated in Fort Wayne, because that, unfortunately, the media can be used as kind of a little punching bag, for one side versus the other.
So when you said it has to be confirmed by independent sources, by number, what are we talking about? 2, 3 people have to have the same idea, or is it more than that? Is there a difference between print and television, or is there basically a standard for journalism? I
think the general standard is 3 is a really good number. If you can get 3 different entities to confirm the same thing, I think for us, that's probably a pretty good standard.
I would say 2 to 3 if it's something contentious and disputed. I mean, yeah, if you have the city budget in front of you, you don't need 3 sources to tell you that
Right.
you know, how much the police department gets. But I think that on those occasions when you are doing something that's hotter, that you might that you would want to verify it through several sources, 2 or 3.
Well, Corinne, you mentioned that people have to trust you. How do you go about developing a source? I mean, can we actually say you develop a source? Do you go out and intentionally try to build relationships with people who may be able to serve as a source later on?
I don't think I do that consciously. I think from having been a reporter on the street for so long, you see the same officers or detectives at crime scenes, and they know that if they tell you something a little more than they tell the competition, but you can't quote them, and then you protect your source, then they'll know at the next crime scene that it's probably okay to trust you with a little tidbit more of information, because let's face it, we're in a competitive business. We'd like to get more information than the competition does. That's what makes people tune in or read whatever outlet you have. I'm not as...
And what shows up in a broadcast or in the newspaper is how you. I think that's how you develop intimacy and trust with a source.
Now, you both have certain limitations. Obviously, for television, 30 minutes, which isn't really 30 minutes, but we call it 30 minutes. For print, there's a certain number of column inches available to you. What do you think is the greatest strength of your particular format? And we'll start with television.
I love television news because there's this immediacy, and there definitely are pros and cons, as you said, but I think the immediacy of television, you can break into programming when something has happened. We just did that a week or 2 ago when there was a shooting downtown, and Fort Wayne police officers shot a suspect we found out later had allegedly pointed a gun at the officers. My boss made the decision to break into regular programming and bring that to people because it was right at the main bus terminal downtown where a lot of people are passing through and they would need to know what's going on there. So I think that the availability of video and sound and the immediacy, and in fact we're facilitating that even more because we're finding that viewers' habits are changing. It's not like they were 30, 40 years ago. So we've launched a 24-hour news station, a news channel, where people can get their news when they want it. And so they can see stories from throughout the day, and it's available 24 hours a day.
Sure, and that's part of the digital spectrum, the digital channels that Indiana's News Center has.
Yes.
It's designated 24-hour. Bob, biggest advantage to print?
Only one? Come on.
We'll give you 2.
Okay, I think the biggest advantage is still staffing size, even with the complaints that everybody makes about how their news operations are being sized down. The newspapers in town have enough people on staff that you have a much more flexibility about making decisions on where to allocate manpower, so you can, in the event of a real crisis or some tremendously big piece of breaking news, you can put 5 people on it or 6 or 7 people in a way that maybe you can't in some other outlets. And then because you have a larger staff, there's also a much greater institutional memory that goes along with newspapers, because I've been there 20 years. There are at least 7 or 8 people who've been there longer at the News-Sentinel than I have. And that is tremendously helpful when you have discussions in the newsroom and you say, just how weird is this elected official's mischief. You can compare it to episodes in the past and weigh it against weigh it against a historical context.
Now, both of you are offering methods of getting information that you didn't have, say, 5 years ago. Whether it's a 24-hour channel, whether it's the websites that are now available for both of you. How is that changing what you do? You can still put 5 people on a story, and when the print version comes out, there can be a very long and elaborate story. What's the benefit to the web availability then?
Well, we old dogs are able to learn new tricks slowly,
slowly,
painfully. We're figuring out how to take advantage of a universe of flexibility that the web offers. You know, more of us are thinking about visuals when we do stories. You know, we're beginning to creep into video a little bit, and you know, as we learn more about the web, as the web develops, we will be able to create a much more multifaceted product than we could have even dreamed of 15 years ago. So I think there's tremendous potential there. We're really only beginning to, we're still at the experimenting with finding the potential stage.
And you have the immediacy issue gets dealt with to a degree because you can actually put things on the web immediately, and the column inches issue goes away as well because
you can link to enormous resources. You can have libraries of material online for people who want to delve into that.
Sure. And for Indiana's News Center, for television in general, you can put the entire press conference up or longer parts of interviews. So there are some advantages for you as well. But how do you look at that, at the web presence in terms of news for television?
I think that that's where most people, certainly the younger generations, are going for their information because they want things now. And they can pick and choose then how much of that they want to do. We sometimes are limited to 30 seconds to tell a story, which is about 4 sentences. You may have multiple inches of column to be able to delve into more detail, which is one of the benefits I think that newspaper has over TV. However, at the end of that 30-second story, we can say, go to indianasnewscenter.com, you will find more information there, or we don't have the resources on a newspaper page to print a map of an area, and we can say go to the news links page and you can see the map there, or there's a listing of all these streets that are going to be closed. And so it's allowing us more freedom and more space and more time to be able to give that information to viewers who choose to pursue that. Again, my interview with Hillary Clinton, they gave me, I think, something unheard of, like 4.5 or 5 minutes out of my 15-minute interview with her, which in TV time is an inordinate amount of time to take up in a newscast.
Yeah, it's almost 25% of the coverage, right?
Exactly.
Or the broadcast right there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but for people who wanted to see the whole thing, we were able to post the entire interview unedited on the website. So if people wanted to see the entire thing, flubs and all, then they could do that. So I think that that's what offers us a good opportunity for expanded coverage for people who choose to do that. Now there are some people who they just need the 30 seconds, and that's good. Go on to the next story. But if they want more, then they have that option.
You know, and something that, as Corinne was talking, I was thinking about that, and I realized I watch a lot more TV now that I have broadband because I you know, whether it's television shows or news, I just, you know, I never liked sitting down in front of a television and having this, you know,
your TV tray with your dinner right in front of you.
This living room experience, the big glass eye in the corner and all that. But I like getting TV news and TV shows online, and that made me think that even as we're learning to do things differently because of the web, people who consume news are learning to use the web and beginning to develop different expectations. So it's not as if, you know, news providers and news consumers are changing together.
We hope in a productive way.
We hope.
Because really, without news, we're missing a very large and important part of government. I mean, you are how we find out about things, and if you can't do your jobs well, we can't be informed, which is a small problem in our version of democracy. Now, there is an expression that campaigns, they campaign in poetry, but they govern in prose. Have you heard the expression before, and what does it mean to you? Do you notice a big difference between campaigns and governing officials themselves?
Well, what I take out of that expression is a campaign has to appeal to the heart. Good governance has to lead with the mind, and that's well. What do you think of it? I can go into I could have a long discussion about why I like the prose more than the poetry and why I think it serves people better. But what's your
Well, I
take
think
on
the
it?
poetry is pretty. You know, and there are a lot of slick ad campaigns that promise a lot of things to a lot of people. That's how you get elected. But when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of it, you aren't going to be able to do maybe half, if not less than that, of what you've promised to people during your campaign. I mean, I'm thinking of the gubernatorial campaign that we just had, and Mitch Daniels had some really slick people producing some really fabulous ads. Jill Long also had some fabulous, Jill Long Thompson had some fabulous ads as well, designed to capture people's attention. And I mean, it's one of those vote for me kind of things. Well, great, but once that person gets into office, there are constraints, whether it's a legislature or a city council, or you can't just go and dictate what people are going to do, because that's why we have checks and balances in government. That's kind of how I interpret it.
Do you find yourself sort of struggling with the poetry and the prose when you're dealing with someone who's already been an elected official? Because you can go look at the prose, you can go look at what they did, and then you have to try and reconcile that with the poetry. Does that create a problem for you? I mean, you said you have to campaign to the heart and you have to lead to you have to govern with the mind.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it engenders fatigue and cynicism in people who want to be engaged citizens, because they, I mean, the only way. You don't have a good, clean way to reconcile those two. What most people wind up saying is, that's campaign stuff. You have to say something. And, as I've been thinking about it, the two examples I can think of locally of a person who campaigned with prose strongly, well, they both got wiped out. And, so that's not a strong recommendation for it. Campaigning with poetry is what works, inspiring people. But this may just be me. This may be me as a former editorial writer speaking, but I'm always so suspicious of inspiration.
Such a cynical thing to say.
That's cynical, Bob. That's terrible. That's terrible.
But think about it. When you're pulling a lever based on inspiration, you just have to trust your good luck once the person gets in office. If you really held people to the white papers that they issue on how they break down questions of policy, it would be fair to hold them to promises. And in fact, you still hold them to promises, but but candidates don't expect to be held to promises. Voters don't expect to be held to promises. And in the middle, reporters are thinking, well, they know that they just have to sing the right song. That's what campaigning is about. So,
you're not as cynical, are you, Corinne? I hope.
There are days. I have my moments. I try not to be as cynical, but I know that having been in this business a long time, I definitely have changed my outlook on some things. But I think that there's a prime example on the national level of people voting for inspiration and hope, and that's the change in the president. I mean, he absolutely campaigned on hope and change, and people believed that, and that's what they voted for. So I think that was an example of poetry that definitely carried him all the way through. An unknown guy from Illinois, and here he is, the President of the United States. He'd been, one term in the state Senate.
Well, now, I do want to ask a quick question. I know that print folks will actually show up to press conferences, sometimes to take notes, sometimes to gather information they'll use in a longer piece later on. Television folks, occasionally just the videographer is going to show up. There's not going to be a reporter there. How should people who are calling press conferences read that? Is there something to read in that? I mean, should they be worried if just a videographer shows up? Should they think, oh, I'm not getting 30 seconds, I'm not getting 10 seconds?
Not at all. Because our staffing is so small that what we are doing, especially at Indiana's News Center, and it's a trend that's happening across the country, is that everybody is becoming what we're calling a multimedia journalist because of the web component, the video component. A lot of times you will see our younger reporters, they will be shooting their own stuff. They'll be carrying their own tripod, their own camera, and doing their own stories. And the photographers that you traditionally see just with their gear, and people who have been in town in a long time know who these guys are when they show up, they are now being asked to come back to the station and actually write the story. So we are trying to utilize as much as we can with the talent that we have, and the talent encompasses photographers through to reporters, to anchors, to producers. And so just because there's just a photographer there doesn't mean that he's not smart enough to ask the right questions and to formulate and craft his own story when he comes back to the station.
Especially if they are one of those people who's been around for 10, 20, 30 years, who know all the back information, like the newsroom over at the News-Sentinel. Apparently, if 20 years puts you in the junior position, clearly that's the case. Mid-range?
Right.
Okay, very good.
Right.
How about when you show up and after I hold my press conference and there's no story, should I be mad at you? What should my reaction be?
Well, couldn't hurt to give me a call if you want to talk it over. Yeah, I'd talk it over, and I think that that it is with print people particularly. It's better. It's always good to assume that nothing's guaranteed until you see it in print. Because we have a little more time to investigate it, and we weigh stories against other stories that are emerging on the same day. There's never a day when you exercise news judgment in a vacuum.
There's more than one story per day? Is that what you're telling me? I'm shocked by that. You actually have to decide what's going to go in?
And things get bounced. Things get held for days while other things take precedence.
So what's the likelihood that something would maybe show up on web page but not in the broadcast or in print? Does that happen?
That would be a decision that would be someone up the ladder from me. I might go out and do the story, but the producers and the assignment editors and the executive producers and the news director just ultimately decide which story goes in which show and in which format, and whether it's just going to be a web-only component. If I could go back to your original question just for a moment, there are times, too, when we will show up to some sort of an event and it turns out it's not really what we thought it was going to be. And so if we've been misled and it turns out to be B instead of A, then that might not be reason enough to give it coverage.
Sure.
So that's kind of a sidebar to that.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay.
So last question for you. What can people do to help you in terms of, I don't want to say ensuring coverage, but making sure that you have the best information possible so that if it's newsworthy, it has a good chance of making it into the broadcast or into print? What can they do to help you?
Well, we could probably take turns on that for about 5 minutes.
Absolutely.
Ironically, I would start out with what you might expect Corinne to say. I'd say, think visually, because newspapers are more and more attuned to visual presentation of news, and we're moving into some video at the same time, but that will help the play of a story if there's some sort of image that could accompany the story.
Because those words, with words you can paint the picture, right? Sure.
You can.
Yeah.
Something else that we always appreciate is because we are doing, as an individual, as a reporter or a multimedia journalist or whatever, we're doing multiple stories a day. Something that very much helps us is if you can give us an example, a living, breathing example. If you are announcing some sort of housing program, if you can have somebody there and kind of do some back work for us and show that person as an example and that person is willing to speak about the experience that they've had, that will then help us a great deal because we like to personalize the story. Instead of just talking about some theoretical program that's out there that may impact you, in TV news, if you can show how it's impacting one person, that personal touch, for some reason, resonates with a viewer more deeply. And so if you can, go just beyond the 5 W's and the how, in the press release and say, we're also going to have somebody there who's, gone through this, we would go, oh, okay, that's kind of cool.
Well, a lot of times I'd be satisfied for people who stopped at the
at the 5 W's, right?
And that's really crucial, is provide some sort of a handout or an email that covers the major points of the message that you're trying to convey as a backstop to whatever else we do. Provide us with the fundamental information and try your best to make sure there's a point to what you're doing.
Yeah.
Imagine that you're imagine convincing somebody who's not interested that your subject is important, and bring a little of that salesmanship to how you present it to a news organization.
And I'm guessing that facts are helpful. If you're going to make a point about a homeless
Yes,
indeed
they
program,
are.
having good data about homeless people in your community, that's a good thing to have.
Yeah, especially the local data.
Yeah. Do you, it used to be you simply got the paper and that was it. Do you want people emailing it to you now as well? I mean, if there is a spreadsheet of data, do you want it electronically as well as in print? Or?
I think we tend to get more stuff electronically now. I think 90% of the news releases that we get in the newsroom are sent to us by email, or we also have our fax machine set up so that it goes to a computer, so it's not just spitting out paper.
Okay.
So we're trying to be a little bit
Yeah.
greener in the newsroom, so
Yeah.
that way we can decide what we want to print and what we don't.
And yeah, I think particularly when you're, it's interesting to use homelessness as an example, because that is what?
Hate it. I mean, I'd love to take the credit.
It was a housing program, and I took it to homelessness.
Okay, that's an interesting example to bring up, because because the data is so sloppy on that. And so when you're bringing up something that is contestable, that isn't a nailed down fact, like when you're making assertions about a 4-digit number of people being homeless in Fort Wayne, as advocacy groups often do, fully explain how you arrive at that number, and think about what constitutes a fact. Think back to those exercises you did in high school, where fact or opinion, and think about how you have to document a fact.
Well, here is the last question for you. I know I said that earlier, but now I really mean it this time. News has obviously changed tremendously in the last 5 years, let alone going back 10 years. What do you think we're going to see 5 years from now? Corinne?
I think that we will find that we will see a rise in viewership in the 24-hour station, because we're finding that viewers' habits, people don't sit at home and watch Walter Cronkite as must-see TV anymore, and they have different schedules of their own, and they want their news when they want it. And 5 o'clock or 5:30 or 6 may not be the time that they may still be commuting. So I think that having either a web-based component or having, in our case, the digital channel where it's 24-hour news, I think that we are going to see an increase in those platforms, because I think that's, over the past 5 years, that's what we've seen, is that people want their news when they want it and not necessarily as must-see television viewing.
Boy, at the risk of being a heretic in my profession, I would say that there's going to be more and more convergence in how news outlets present news. And we're familiar with this in the TV radio or TV newspaper cooperation, and newspaper radio cooperation. But I wouldn't be surprised if blogging becomes such a big deal that there is some merging of that. If you look 10 years down the road, there are going to be A-list bloggers who like the exposure of being connected with a news outlet, particularly if they're the type of blogger who break news occasionally. And there may be bloggers who develop such a big following that it's an advantage for a news organization to have a relationship with a network of credible, followed, respected bloggers locally.
Of course, we get back to the issue of credibility when it comes to the bloggers. Have they checked 2 sources or 3 sources in order to confirm the stories they're running? And when you say A-list bloggers, you mean people who've actually treat it like journalism.
Right.
Yeah.
There are a lot of bloggers out there who just throw whatever against the wall and see what sticks. I mean, and so that's been part of the problem, I think, because it's not necessarily a self-policed industry, more like journalism.
Yeah, I would say that, in Fort Wayne, when I think A-list, there are 3 blogs come to mind. And there are, 500 blogs in Fort Wayne? I remember 4 or 5 years ago, somebody in another city asked me, "So does everybody in Fort Wayne have a blog? Is that something that Welcome Wagon handles when you come to town?"
It is, exactly. Not many people know that. When you get here, here's your site, blog away.
Right.
Well, I want to thank both of you for coming in. I do appreciate it. I think that this has been a very good conversation on covering government and politics. I want to thank Corinne Prose from Indiana's News Center. I want to thank Bob Caylor from the News-Sentinel. I also want to thank everyone who's been watching us, whether it's on CATV or on MDON. Thank you very much for joining us, and please make sure you check out other videos on our website. To the bloggers, have they checked 2 sources or 3 sources in order to confirm the stories they're running? And when you say A-list bloggers, you mean people who've actually treat it like journalism.
Right, right.
Yeah.
There are a lot of bloggers out there who just throw whatever against the wall and see what sticks. I mean, and so that's been part of the problem, I think, because it's not necessarily a self-policed industry, more like journalism.
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, in Fort Wayne, when I think A-list, there are 3 blogs come to mind. And there are, what, 500 blogs in Fort Wayne? Mm-hmm. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, somebody in another city asked me, "So does everybody in Fort Wayne have a blog? Is that something that Welcome Wagon handles when you come to town?"
It is, exactly. Not many people know that. When you get here, here's your site, blog away.
Right.
Well, I want to thank both of you for coming in. I do appreciate it. I think that this has been a very good conversation on covering government and politics. I want to thank Corinne Prose from Indiana's News Center. I want to thank Bob Caylor from the News-Sentinel. I also want to thank everyone who's been watching us, whether it's on CATV or on MDON. Thank you very much for joining us, and please make sure you check out other videos on our website.